This is a lecture about the contemporary Ukrainian prose. Welcome. My name is Rostyslav Semkiv and I teach literary criticism in Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. It is one of the oldest universities in Ukraine. And now I'd like to tell some words about those books through which perhaps it is the most possible and important to understand Ukrainian culture, contemporary Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian perhaps history since last 20 or 30 years, and of course some flashbacks on Ukrainian history before. So we of course have two different questions to begin with, and the first is the question of subjectivity. Of course it is my personal opinion on those books, and maybe those books which are quite important inside Ukrainian culture now and inside Ukrainian literature now don't tell much about its culture for the foreign audiences. So we have to pick up to 10 or 20 maybe perhaps books about Ukraine. Why prose? Because prose is telling its history more straightforward. Poetry perhaps more complicated and its messages maybe not so clear, so we have to concentrate on prose and try to find those books which perhaps in translation can be more useful for foreign readers to understand Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian people. And this lecture is a part of Book Arsenal Festival. Book Arsenal Festival, alongside with this with the central book fair in Ukraine. It is also a combination of different presentations and discussions, lectures, different performances and other cultural activities. And besides, it is a great chance to the authors and the publishers to meet their audiences, their best audiences they can have. It is also a possibility to follow different trends and to foresee maybe the nearest future in literary or cultural development. The second question I'd like to address, it is the definition, what is contemporary? Yes, what is contemporary literature? Because we can have different visions, and there are two main approaches to the definition of contemporary Ukrainian literature. The most common approach is to define that contemporary Ukrainian literature begins from 1991, so that is the year of Ukrainian independence. And after the independence, after this historical event, we have a completely new literature and a completely new understanding of what is literature and what should be written, and which are values that literature is going to promote. So the majority of Ukrainian literature researchers would tend to understand the 1995 at the beginning of the contemporary Ukrainian literature. In fact, it has a sense because of this former Soviet paradigm of literature completely differed from that one we have now. Of course, it was highly censored. There was a narrow scope of themes, of different topics that can be used. Even whole genres of literature which are now popular and are quite popular in world literatures, they were forbidden, like fantasy or horror. They didn't exist in the communist or Soviet literature, the literature of Soviet times. So after 1991, of course, literature became more democratic, more free, open-minded, and the authors got a chance to speak on a more wide range of topics with the help of more explicit lexicon and so on and so forth. But there is another point of view And this another point of view is to start the contemporary Ukrainian literature since 1986, so in 5 years before, and it is the year of Chernobyl disaster. It is the point when everything changed in minds of former Soviet citizens, because this disaster marked a certain disbelief in state, in official government, in everything that was told to those Soviet citizens about the situation. One of the most prominent Ukrainian academicians, Tamara named her main research, her main monography, the post-Chernobyl library. Post-Chernobyl library, that is perhaps maybe the best metaphor about the contemporary Ukrainian literature in this point of view. So we have two different approaches, and it depends on which we choose if we speak about there certain authors or books which are important. If we start from this Chernobyl disaster from 1986, then I'd rather say that we should start contemporary Ukrainian literature from a documentary novel of Yuri Shcherbak. This novel has the title Chernobyl, and it is a novel of 1987, already a year after the disaster, and that's a number of different voices, of different documents, a combination of different points of view on this disaster, and it influenced much the further development of this topic in literature, in poetry, and even now we have the continuation of this topic, for example, in very popular books of Markian Kamysh, a young author. Yuri Shcherbak is a writer from the so-called generation of 60s, and that generation was a number of authors, a number of writers, of artists from different fields, and they were in opposition to that time Soviet regime, and they were oppressed, they were non-conformists, and but they gave a very powerful impulse for the development of literature afterwards. If we take another point of view, and if we start Ukrainian contemporary literature since 1991, then we have another two persons which started to write already in the late 80s, but then continued, and was a very kind of explosion in the 90s. And these two are Yuri Andrukhovych and Oksana Zabuzhko. They were quite revolutionary in literature. Their novels, their first novels, earliest novels, are already translated into English. And as for Yuri Andrukhovych, his first three novels, Recreations, the Moscoviad, his English translation, and the Perverzion, in fact, they depict, they illustrate, they put forward a new image of a writer. Okay, in every of these novels, the writer is the center of its plot. It is not already this correct, ideologically correct, conformed author from Soviet times. It is, of course, open-minded and free person with the European values, with democratic values. He is also more free in his actions, in his creation. Another famous novel by Yuri Andrukhovych, The 12 Circles, it is also translated. And further, we have two more books which perhaps are to be translated. One of them, it is a collection of travel essays the Lexicon of Intimate Cities, In this collection, there are 111 essays about different towns and cities in Europe, in Ukraine, in the whole world, which were visited by Yuri Andrukhovych. They may be bigger or lesser, but it is interesting to read his points of view about his travels and about these different towns and countries. And the most recent, since 2 years, book of Yuri Andrukhovych can be translated into English as Darlings of Justice or Lovers of Justice, Kochancy Justicji, and this is the collection of several phantasmagoric stories about different historical persons, but they are, as far as Yuri Andrukhovych is quite a postmodern writer, so they are filled with different insinuations or transformations of these real historical plots and persons inside them. Oksana Zabuzhko is another rebellious, scandalous author, and her novel, the fieldwork in Ukrainian sex, was a kind of explosion in 1996. It is a kind of feminist manifesto, and it influenced much the next generation of women writers in Ukrainian literature. After that, Oksana Zabuzhko, who is perhaps the most translated Ukrainian author, wrote the novel The Museum of Abandoned Secrets. It is also already translated, alongside with her essays and a number of a collection of her verses. But perhaps the most precious examples of her writings are her short prose, and I think it's a good material for the translation. Her stories or novels as Mimi Lena, Sister, 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 Girls, and so on. So we have these two authors, Yuri Andrukhovych and Oksana Zabuzhko, who are still very active, and of course their next writings will be also very interesting. One more author from the late 80s and from the beginning of 90s, it is Yuri Andrukhovych. Yuri Andrukhovych is quite a pioneer in Ukrainian popular literature, genre literature, especially in fantasy and in horror. He composed two collections of short stories, and one of the most popular, his and most known, his fantasy, kind of phantasmagoric fiction, fantasy novel is Myroslava. And this is a phantasmagoric transformation of his own town of Lviv. And in fact, Yuri Andrukhovych is perhaps the most known author who nowadays writes about Lviv. He has a number up to perhaps already 8 books about different historical periods in Lviv since the 17th century and till the late of 20th century. So all his novels about Lviv, they depict the city in quite a magical, realistic style. And he has the realistic setting, but also many phantasmagories incorporated in it. Perhaps the most important book is The Death Tango, and The Death Tango is translated into German. It has a kind of sequels or a parallel texts as The Night Reporter, the Censor of Dreams, a number of different texts about Lviv and its mysterious side, or its mysterious dimensions. His Yuri Andruchovych's novels, they are quite interesting and quite popular. And there is one more, his interesting book since the early 80s. It's a kind of dystopia. The title, Welcome to City of Rats, or Rats Town. And I think this dystopia is very important in understanding of this change in the consciousness of Ukrainians at the beginning of 19th. Right now, perhaps the most interesting, most dynamic, and perhaps most known author is Serhiy Zhadan, who started in also in 90s, though he is of a younger generation, and his main texts in prose were written since the beginning of millennium. So several of Serhiy Zhadan novels are already translated. His Depeche Mode and Voroshilograd, it was translated into German as Jazz in Donbas, also Mesopotamia, but he continues to write very dynamically, and every year another new book appears. Perhaps he is the most active of contemporary Ukrainian writers, and the best of his novels nowadays is his internat novel. It can be translated as The Orphanage. This is perhaps the best book about war in the east of Ukraine, and it is already the best book among his own writings. It's kind of an odyssey, a kind of a travel beyond this dividing border, and maybe the best depiction of the atmosphere of this war. On the other hand, we already have a number of quite good veteran novels. We have veteran literature, books which are written by those people who returned from front, who returned from war, and who try to illustrate the situation there in the East. I guess in the nearest future we'll see a number of first-ranked authors which will write about this topic. But till this time, The Orphanage by Serhiy Zhadan is perhaps the best book about it. And we also have the women's experience about war. several books written by women about their own experiences or the transformations of the others' experiences. There are two most important and perhaps brightest books on this topic. One is written by Tamara Horikha-Zernia, and it is named Dotsa, or Daughter. This is a novel about the change of a life in Donetsk. At the beginning it is peaceful life, and then steadily changed. Unknown militaries came, and we have the beginning of war, and we have the beginning of occupation. And we have the real people experiences, real people lives interlinked within this plot, and we have their experiences of change of their life from peaceful to the wartime. Another novel, it is a novel written by Hayska, and she received the European Union Literary Prize for this novel in 2019. The novel under the title Behind the Back, and it is about complete another experience. It is about the experience of a woman who waits her boyfriend, her man from front, about her understanding, also about change, because at the beginning she, the main protagonist, she doesn't understand why it is important to go there, to fight, to take part in this war. From the beginning, she thinks that it's just a kind of a game for boys who are in search of their self-realization. But afterwards, step by step, this understanding changes. So these two books, they were special highlights of the previous year in Ukrainian literature, and I think they will be translated in a number of languages, and it is the best way to understand these three books, Orphanage by Serhiy Zhadan, and Behind the Back of Hayska, and Daughter of Tamara by Tamara Horikha-Zernia. These books are best to understand what is going on there in the East. They are very qualitable illustrations and reconstructions of different views onto the situation. Then three more names. They are quite different in their writings. They are quite different in styles, but they are very vivid. First of them is Sofia Andrukhovych. She wrote already 3 novels, and the most celebrated her novel is Felix Austria. It's an elegant postmodern historical romance. She reconstructs history of 100 years ago in her native town Ivano-Frankivsk, that was formerly Stanislavl. So that's the transformation. And this novel, this romance, is already filmed. There is a film that was quite a sensation the previous year. And just now she wrote another big novel, Amadoka, and it is also a kind of historical novel, but with different experience, modern nowadays experiences interviewed into this plot. Another person, it is Katerina Colette, and she is originally a poet and perhaps one of the brightest poets nowadays in Ukrainian literature. But 2 years ago she made a first step in her prose writing, and she wrote a collection of short stories, The Land of Lost People. We can find there different styles and different approaches. There are a number of historical reconstructions also in these stories, but we also have some echoes of the Eastern War, but in fact it is very powerful psychological prose. And the last but not least in this list is Miroslav Laiuk. Miroslav Laiuk is already the author of 4 novels, but only 2 of them are already published. And his first novel, Babornia, it cannot be translated. It's a specific Carpathian word. So Babornia, it is also a good try to think about history, to think about the history of his own native district, of the district of Carpathian Mountains, and of people which live there. We also have there former period before Second World War and nowadays contemporary period, and they are they also combined in the kind of this historical phantasmagory. We can also see this magical and realistic combination in Miroslav Laiuk, both published novels in Babornia and the world uncreated, so these perhaps are the most important names with their prose, which can be followed, the creation work of which perhaps should be followed to find the most interesting texts in future, or those that were written but were not translated. And there is also a number of other authors I'd like to pay attention to. I won't be able to speak about their novels or short prose, but they are quite important, as it seems to me, and among their works, some very important books can be found for the translation. Some names from the elder generation. It is Maria Matios, also Marina Hrimich, Larisa Denisenko, then Taras Prochasko, Andrei Kurkov, and Anatoly Dnistrovy. And from the younger generation, they are Irena Karpa and Natalka Snedanko, Tatiana Malerchuk, also Oleg Kotsarev and Katerina Babkina. They all have 1 or 2 novels or 1 or 2 short story collection. But they are, of course, quite dynamic and also propose new titles, not every year, but perhaps once per 2 years. All of them try to write psychological prose. They try to understand and try to depict different new experiences as a new immigration experience, the experience of a reactualization of previous history, of once forbidden or banned history, and so we of course will see very interesting books from them in future. And also there is a number of authors which work in genre literature and mainly in fantasy, detective story, thriller, or even horror. And perhaps the most active and the most important among them are Max Kidruk. He has up to 10 novels perhaps now. Also Vladimir Arenev, also Alexander Mechet, and Svetlana Taratorina, who gained one of the most important literary prizes in Ukraine last year. So I think that these authors, though they work in different genre niches, they are quite interesting, and they also can be quite interesting for translations and for understanding the changes in Ukrainian literature nowadays. To summarize, I'd say that Ukrainian contemporary literature develops in different directions. On one hand, it has a number of good books inside the traditionally strong area of its existence, in psychological prose, in prose of psychological reconstruction. It gives the possibility to enclose, to embrace the new experiences, new historical experiences since last 3 decades. But also it develops in some genre niches which were not so adequately developed, and I guess that in this direction it also has good perspective.